In the 1980s, the general coverage of China by the American press had been pretty positive. There was this sense China was opening up, they were becoming less hostile, there was an influx of foreign investment. And then suddenly you had these images of, violence and repression. And I think it was magnified by the fact that the American broadcast media were there in large numbers with the technology to transmit it. And I think that had a big impact on American perceptions of China. And it kind of shattered this image of China. And, it created a different and much darker picture of China. It's very hard to generalize. I don't actually think there were a lot of people who thought China was ever going to become a Western-style democracy. But there is no question that in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, China was becoming a more open society. It was welcoming international investment. It was welcoming international exchanges. The Chinese were traveling abroad in much greater numbers. They were hosting the Olympics, and don't forget the slogan when they were bidding for the Olympics was "A more open Beijing awaits the Olympics." The people running China wanted to see a more open China within limits, but a more open China because they felt it served their interests of promoting economic development and lifting the country out of poverty and making it a great international power. Under Xi Jinping, the kind of prevailing analysis has shifted. I think the 2008-2009 global financial crisis played a major role in the sense that Chinese leaders looked around the world and they said, the Americans are on their way down, the West Europeans are on their way down, we're on the way up. So now is a time where we can be more assertive in pushing our interests and in pushing back against our critics. And I think the other thing is that I think Xi Jinping and the people around him looked at the China that came out of the 1990s and early 2000s and saw massive corruption, growing income inequality, potential instability that could threaten the party's rule. And so Xi has kind of shifted gears and made reimposition of party authority and security as the central feature, even outstripping economic development. But these are essentially internal Chinese policy decisions. One of the most unfortunate consequences of the expulsion of so many American media journalists and the difficulties that so many other foreign journalists have getting visas is that it's changing the nature of coverage in China. Well, China is a hard place to cover under the best of circumstances, and Xi Jinping has implemented policies that have tightened political control, economic control, social control, so that makes it harder for journalists. He also himself has stayed back. He doesn't do interviews. It may be partly the information landscape has changed. Xi Jinping doesn't need to give an interview to the New York Times to send a message around the world anymore. He's got many, many other tools. So you add that to his instinctive desire for tighter control and his deep-rooted suspicion and hostility towards the Western media. And I think that goes a long way towards explaining why this Chinese leadership is less engaged and less comfortable engaging than previously. Coincided with a more general tightening of political and social controls in Chinese society, and it certainly makes the job of the journalist more difficult. China itself is a more modern, outward-looking society than it was, say, when I first went in 1973. So it's not possible to isolate China as thoroughly as it was, say, in the Mao years. But it just takes a lot of work and a lot of digging and a lot of frustration, and you're not necessarily going to find information as easily as a dozen or 20 years ago, but it doesn't mean the task is impossible. I think Hong Kong has become a harder place for journalists to operate because the national security law and Article 23 are going to make people more reluctant to talk to journalists. I think it is important, you know, in all the discussion of Hong Kong, to try to imagine for a minute what the events of 2019 must have looked like to Xi Jinping and the people, because there was always a lot of suspicion about Hong Kong because it was so westernized and it was so separate and so on. And my sense is that they saw in Hong Kong essentially a rebellious peripheral area heavily influenced by foreigners that was challenging the central government. And I think that must have absolutely terrified them.